The truck's engine rumbled as Sam gripped the steering wheel, eyes fixed on the dark stretch of highway ahead. It was a route he'd taken dozens of times before, but tonight felt different. The moon cast an eerie glow, its pale light illuminating the empty road. The radio played an old rock tune, but even that familiar comfort felt hollow in the silence that surrounded him. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, 2:33 a.m. The witching hour, he thought with a smirk that quickly faded as he spotted a shadow flickering at the edge of his vision. A quick look in the side mirror showed nothing but the endless dark, but the unease lingered, crawling up his spine like icy fingers. Sam shook his head and forced himself to focus. "You're just tired," he muttered. Yet, the hairs on the back of his neck stood on end as the shadow appeared again, this time darting across the road like a wisp of smoke. His foot hovered over the brake, but there was nothing to stop for. No animal, no figure, just an unsettling void. Suddenly, the radio crackled, cutting through the quiet with a burst of static. Sam's pulse quickened as a voice whispered, barely audible over the noise, "Turn back, while you can." He slammed the button to silence it, heart pounding in his chest. The road stretched ahead, impossibly long, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was driving straight into something far more sinister than an empty highway. Sam's knuckles whitened as he gripped the wheel tighter, the radio's sudden silence feeling even more oppressive than the static. The shadows outside the truck seemed to close in, trees lining the road with gnarled branches that reached out like skeletal fingers. Every mile he drove felt like a deeper descent into an unseen world, one where the rules of reality started to blur. A flash of movement caught his eye, something running parallel to the truck, matching his speed. He dared not look, but his peripheral vision confirmed his fear. It was as if a shadow itself had come alive, a humanoid form darting alongside him with inhuman grace. Sam's pulse thundered in his ears, a cold sweat breaking out across his brow. Without warning, the truck's headlights dimmed, flickering wildly before plunging the road into a strobe of light and dark. The shadowy figure outside was suddenly gone, replaced by the suffocating blackness pressing against the glass. Sam swallowed hard, forcing himself to breathe. The steering wheel seemed to hum beneath his hands, vibrating with an unnatural energy that seeped into his bones. A deep guttural noise rumbled from the back of the truck, as if something heavy had shifted in the cargo hold. Sam's heart leaped into his throat. He knew the trailer was empty. He had checked before starting his haul. The sound came again, louder this time, a dragging, scraping noise like claws raking over metal. He glanced at the rearview mirror, expecting to see nothing but shadow. Instead, two pinpricks of light glared back at him, like eyes glowing with malevolent intent. Sam's breath caught, frozen in place by their stare. Keep going," he whispered to himself, the words a shaky mantra. But deep down, he knew that whatever was back there wasn't going to let him leave unscathed. Sam's pulse was erratic, every muscle in his body tensed like a coiled spring. He stole a glance back at the mirror, but the glowing eyes were gone. For a moment, silence reclaimed the cab, stretching thin over the pounding of his heartbeat. The road in front of him yawned wide, an unending ribbon of darkness, and he pushed the truck harder, urging it to speed him away from whatever horror lurked in the shadows. Suddenly, the CB radio crackled to life again. This time there was no mistaking the voice. It was low, guttural, and reverberated like a growl. "You can't outrun us." The words hung heavy in the air, taunting him, and Sam felt his blood turn cold. His foot pressed down harder on the gas, but the truck seemed sluggish, as if resisting him. The dashboard lights flickered, dimming to a faint glow. Sam's vision tunneled, focused solely on the narrow stretch of illuminated road. Then movement, an unnatural shift in the rearview mirror. He turned his head, eyes widening as he saw the impossible. A figure, cloaked in black, crouched in the middle of the trailer, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. The figure's mouth moved, though no sound came out. Sam's eyes darted to the road only to find a shadow blocking his path. It stood tall and unmoving, limbs elongated and twisted, with those same glowing eyes fixed on him. Time seemed to stutter. With a scream, Sam swerved to avoid the figure, tires skidding and shrieking as the truck veered off the road. The world spun, a sickening blur of black and silver, as the truck's massive frame tilted and crashed sideways into the ditch. Glass shattered and metal groaned under the force. Sam's head slammed against the steering wheel, pain erupting behind his eyes. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the figure outside the window, peering in with a smile that split its face too wide. Sam's consciousness returned in painful waves, his head throbbing and a metallic taste of blood coating his tongue. The cab was tilted at an awkward angle. Crushed against the earth, the windshield splintered into a web of jagged cracks. Outside, the darkness pressed in, unnaturally silent. The memory of that wide, impossible grin sent shivers down his spine. He shifted, groaning as pain lanced through his side. Reaching for the CB radio, his fingers found only broken plastic. His phone had flown somewhere out of reach, and the faint light filtering through the cracks barely illuminated his surroundings. Panic gnawed at him as he strained to listen for any sign of movement, any hint of the malevolent figure that had driven him off the road. A soft, scraping sound echoed from the back of the truck, followed by a low, hollow laugh. Sam's breath quickened. He glanced at the rearview mirror, which now dangled uselessly from a wire, and caught sight of a faint glow. The eyes. They blinked, then disappeared, as if taunting him. With shaking hands, Sam tried to pry open the driver's side door, but the metal had buckled, trapping him inside. The scraping sound grew louder, accompanied by a rhythmic thump. Something was moving inside the trailer, pacing, growing restless. "Help. Please," he whispered, knowing full well that no one was around to hear. The night outside remained a void, swallowing his voice before it could travel. His heart thudded so hard he felt it might burst, the sound merging with the thumping from behind him. Then came the whisper, clear and deliberate. "You shouldn't have ignored the warnings." Sam froze as the cab rocked, the weight of something large shifting against it. The laughter returned, louder now, echoing around him until it seemed to seep into his bones. He squeezed his eyes shut, praying it was all a nightmare he would wake from. But when he opened them, a pale hand pressed against the cracked windshield, fingers splayed and twitching. Sam's breathing turned shallow as the pale hand slid across the cracked glass, leaving streaks of condensation in its wake. The fingers moved with a deliberate, almost playful slowness, tracing shapes that made no sense to him. His throat tightened, each breath a struggle against the crushing weight of panic. He wanted to scream, to thrash, but he was trapped by the twisted metal, by the darkness, and by the paralyzing fear rooting him to the spot. The scraping from the back of the truck had stopped, replaced by a silence that rang louder than any noise. Then a new sound began. A low, guttural humming, as if whoever or whatever was out there was singing a lullaby meant to haunt. The glow of the eyes appeared again, this time on the passenger side window, blinking as if watching him with detached curiosity. Sam's body reacted before his mind could, and he yanked his arm free, ignoring the sharp sting of metal slicing into his skin. Blood trickled down, warm and sticky, but he didn't care. All that mattered was escape. He threw his shoulder against the door, the pain exploding in fresh, brutal waves as he forced it open inch by inch. Just as he managed to wedge it enough to slip out, a sudden weight slammed into the truck's side, tipping it further into the ditch. Sam tumbled, hitting the ground hard and rolling into the underbrush. Gasping, he scrambled to his feet, eyes darting to the truck. It loomed like a fallen giant, dark and lifeless, except for the shadow that moved within the cab. A voice, cold and distorted, cut through the silence. "Run, little driver. We'll find you again." Sam didn't wait. He bolted into the woods, branches slashing at his face and arms, feet pounding on the uneven ground. The night seemed alive. the whispering leaves and distant rustles echoing the words that had been seared into his mind. He ran until his legs threatened to give out, until his lungs burned and the metallic tang of fear coated his mouth. When he finally dared to stop, leaning against a tree, the woods were deathly quiet. No glowing eyes, no sinister humming, just the sound of his own ragged breathing. Relief washed over him, shaky and thin. But as he took a step forward, something cold brushed against his ankle. He looked down and saw a pale, twitching hand, half buried in the leaves, gripping his boot. The last thing he heard before the world spun into darkness was that same laugh, echoing through the trees as if the night itself were mocking him. Derek, a long-haul trucker with miles of asphalt beneath his boots and stories to spare, prided himself on knowing every back road and highway like the veins on his hands. But one night, while hauling a shipment through the Midwestern plains, his GPS inexplicably blinked out, leaving him in the dark on a road that wasn't on any map he'd seen before. The night was moonless, the sky a dense blanket of stars offering no guidance. The headlights of his rig carved through the inky darkness, revealing an old, weathered sign by the roadside. The letters were barely legible but read, Black Hollow Road. Derek frowned. He'd never heard of it, but with no signal and miles of empty road behind him, there was little choice but to keep moving forward. The deeper he drove into the unfamiliar stretch, the narrower the road became, flanked by ancient trees whose limbs arched over like the ribs of a great beast. The shadows seemed to shift, almost as if following his progress. The rumble of the engine felt distant, muted by the oppressive silence of the surroundings. Suddenly, the static on his CB radio flared to life, a voice breaking through in disjointed whispers. Turn back. Not safe. The voice dissolved into a crackle before Derek could react. A shiver traced down his spine as he glanced at the rearview mirror. It was empty, save for the dark ribbon of road trailing behind him. But deep in the shadows, he thought he saw movement, a flicker of white, like cloth or skin. The road dipped, and his truck bounced, jolting him back to focus. But the dread, an unnatural pressure, pressed in on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was on this forgotten highway was waiting for him, somewhere ahead in the suffocating dark. The whisper on the CB radio gnawed at Derek's nerves. He tried to rationalize it. Interference, an old transmission perhaps. But the voice had sounded urgent, almost pleading. He kept glancing at the mirror, half expecting to see something lurking in the dark. The road twisted sharply, and the truck's tires skidded, gravel spitting beneath them. He gripped the wheel tighter, muscles coiled with tension. A few more miles crept by, the road growing narrower, almost suffocatingly so. The trees on either side felt closer, the bark gnarled and twisted as if shaped by unseen hands. His headlights swept across something up ahead, a figure standing in the middle of the road, motionless. Derek's heart leaped into his throat and he slammed the brakes, the rig shuddering to a halt mere feet from the person. The figure was draped in white, tattered clothing, its head bowed. Derek's hands trembled as he reached for the window control, hesitant to let in the night air. Before he could react, the figure's head snapped up, eyes dark and hollow, a mouth that opened too wide with a voiceless scream. In an instant, it dissolved into the shadows, leaving the road bare once more. Sweat slicked Derek's face as he punched the gas, the truck roaring forward. Whatever had just happened was enough to override any logical thought. He needed to get off this road. But as the headlights traced the path ahead, he noticed something. Every mile marker he passed read 0, as if mocking him, trapping him in an endless loop. The CB radio sputtered again, louder this time. The same voice returned, clearer and more desperate. "You must not stop, they know you're here." Derek's blood ran cold. He stared at the radio, heart hammering. The voice sounded so close, as if the speaker were inside the cab with him. He stole a glance at the passenger seat, half expecting to see a shadow or figure. But it was empty. Suddenly, a chorus of whispers surrounded him, coming from nowhere and everywhere at once. They rose and fell, murmuring words he couldn't decipher, some laughing, some sobbing. The noise grew, wrapping around him like a living entity. He pressed his hands to his ears, but it did little to muffle the sound. A metallic screech erupted as the truck's dashboard lights flickered, casting erratic shadows. The speedometer needle twitched wildly, and the headlights dimmed until the road ahead was barely visible. Panic took root in Derek's chest, suffocating him. He slammed his foot on the pedal, urging the truck to move faster, but the vehicle only groaned, resisting him as if the very road were holding it back. The road opened into a clearing, and suddenly, Derek's rig rolled to an involuntary stop. He couldn't move, couldn't breathe. The whispers ceased all at once, plunging the world into a silence that was almost deafening. Ahead, standing beneath a canopy of tangled branches, were figures cloaked in white, faces obscured. They stood in perfect rows, unmoving, their presence unnaturally still. One stepped forward, lifting an arm to point directly at Derek. It had no eyes, only hollow voids where eyes should be. The truck's lights blinked out, leaving him in complete darkness. "Leave!" A single voice boomed, shaking the ground beneath him. The cab door on the driver's side opened by itself, creaking slowly. Derek's instincts screamed at him to stay inside, but an invisible force yanked at his limbs. He tumbled out, landing hard on the cold ground. The figures didn't move, but their eyeless gaze bore down on him, a weight that threatened to crush his sanity. Fighting against the unseen force, Derek stumbled to his feet, legs numb with fear. The air felt thick, oppressive, pressing against his chest. He forced himself to run, darting into the woods lining the road, branches slashing at his arms and face. The sound of whispers resumed, now shrill and angry, following him deeper into the thicket. He didn't know how long he ran. Time had lost all meaning. When he finally collapsed, breathless and shaking, the whispers had faded, replaced by the chirp of crickets and the rustle of leaves. The sky was no longer black but a deep blue, streaked with the first hints of dawn. He looked back and saw the road behind him, but it was empty. No figures, no truck, just a lonely stretch of asphalt. He staggered back to the road, eyes searching for his truck. It was there, parked neatly as if none of the night's horrors had happened. Cautiously, he approached, every step weighed down by dread. The cab was intact, engine humming softly, headlights casting a warm, reassuring glow. A note rested on the dashboard, written in smudged, hurried letters. "Never return. They are always watching." Derek drove away without looking back, his hands white-knuckled on the wheel, the note crumpled in his pocket. The road unwound before him, normal and mundane under the rising sun. But the memories clung to him, a reminder that some roads should remain forgotten, that some paths held secrets not meant for the living. Even now, when the wind blew just right, he could swear he heard whispers echoing from the trees, reminding him of the night he met the watchers of Black Hollow Road. Mark was used to driving long, isolated roads, but this one felt different. The highway cut through the vast, unyielding desert, with only the occasional rusted sign and weather-beaten billboard to remind him that civilization existed somewhere far behind. It was Halloween night, and the air seemed to thrum with a peculiar energy, as if the desert itself was holding its breath. The road ahead was a thin, endless line beneath a pitch-black sky. His headlights barely seemed to pierce the dark, illuminating only the few yards in front of him. The radio played soft static after losing signal miles ago, so he reached over and switched it off. The sudden silence pressed against him like a weight. Just as he settled back into the monotony of the drive, something moved at the edge of the headlights. A shape, small and indistinct, flickered into view and then disappeared. He blinked, straining to see, and then there it was again. A person standing by the side of the road, thumb out as if hitching a ride. Mark's heart thudded uncomfortably. He hadn't seen another soul for hours, and now, in the middle of nowhere, stood a figure with a hood pulled low over their face. Every instinct screamed at him to keep driving, but guilt pricked at him. What if they really needed help? Reluctantly, Mark eased his foot off the gas, the truck slowing as he rolled closer to the stranger. He lowered the window just enough to call out, "You all right, buddy? Need a ride?" The figure stepped closer, and as the headlights fully illuminated them, Mark's breath caught in his throat. The hooded face turned up to reveal hollow, unblinking eyes that reflected the light in an eerie, glassy sheen. Mark's pulse quickened as he stared at the figure, frozen in place by the truck's beam. The hitchhiker's face was gaunt, cheeks sunken as if drained of life, and those eyes, dark, empty pools that locked onto him with a lifeless intensity. Mark's grip on the steering wheel tightened, and he fought the urge to roll up the window and speed away. The figure tilted its head slightly, as if examining Mark. Then, without a word, it moved around the truck's front, the shadow shifting as it walked. Mark swallowed hard, muscles tense, each moment stretching unbearably long. He glanced in the side mirror, expecting the hitchhiker to reappear at the passenger door. But the mirror reflected only the black void of the desert. A soft tap at the window made him jump. The hitchhiker stood there, now close enough for Mark to see the frayed edges of the tattered cloak and the fine white dust that clung to their figure like a shroud. Hesitating, Mark reached for the door lock, fingers trembling. Before he could decide what to do, the voice came, a low, hollow whisper that seeped into the cab like a draft. "You should have kept driving." Mark's chest tightened as the temperature inside the truck plummeted, his breath forming misty clouds. The hitchhiker was no longer outside. They were sitting beside him, expressionless, those hollow eyes now turned straight ahead as if they belonged there all along. Mark's hands shook as he gripped the steering wheel, eyes darting between the road and the specter sitting beside him. The silence in the cab was suffocating, broken only by the hum of the engine and the erratic pounding of his heart. He tried to speak, to demand who or what this hitchhiker was, but his mouth felt dry, the words refusing to form. The hitchhiker turned its head slowly, the empty eyes meeting his. A smile crept onto its pale face, thin and cold. "Drive," it whispered. Mark's body obeyed before his brain caught up. He pressed down on the gas, the truck lurching forward. The landscape blurred past in darkness, the road a silver ribbon under the stark glow of the headlights. The figure didn't move or speak again, but kept its gaze locked ahead, as if guiding Mark deeper into the abyss. Minutes bled into hours, or maybe it was just seconds. Time felt meaningless. The air in the cab was freezing, and Mark's hands numbed on the wheel. He cast a sidelong glance at the hitchhiker. It was no longer there. Relief surged, and he let out a shaky breath. But the reprieve was short-lived. The radio, which had been silent, crackled to life with a jolt, playing an old song, warped and slow, as if dragged from the depths of an ancient grave. The lyrics dripped into the cab, each word resonating like a chant. "You can't outrun what follows. You can only wait for tomorrow." Mark's eyes snapped back to the road just in time to see the figure standing directly in front of the truck, arms outstretched, a twisted grin spread wide. He screamed, yanking the wheel to swerve, but it was too late. The truck plowed through the figure with a shuddering crash that sent Mark hurtling forward as the seatbelt dug into his chest. The rig skidded, tires screeching as it veered off the asphalt and into the sand. Dazed, Mark's vision swam as he blinked back, the stars clouding his eyes. The truck sat tilted in the sand, its engine sputtering before dying completely, plunging the world into silence. Outside, the wind whispered across the dunes, carrying with it a chilling tune that seemed all too familiar. He looked at the passenger seat. It was empty, but a long, thin trail of white dust lay scattered across the vinyl. Mark's heartbeat thundered, a drumbeat of panic and confusion. He reached for the door handle, the cool metal grounding him for a split second before he pushed it open and stumbled out. The desert was vast, the sky an ocean of stars glaring down like watchful eyes. He scanned his surroundings, searching for any sign of the hitchhiker, but there was nothing, just the wind and the ghostly silence. A sudden pressure gripped his chest, cold and sharp. He gasped, looking down to see a pale, translucent hand pressing into his chest from behind. He turned slowly, dread pooling in his gut, and met the hollow eyes once more. The figure whispered one final word that echoed into the night. "Mine." When the truck was discovered days later, buried partially in sand, the police found it empty with no signs of a struggle, only the faint outline of a handprint on the passenger seat and a small, scrawled message on the dashboard. "Keep driving." Mark's disappearance became just another piece of the lore that surrounded the endless highway, a story that truckers would whisper to one another at roadside diners, warning of the hitchhiker who waits for the unwary, who only appears when the night is darkest and the road stretches endlessly ahead. Ben was a seasoned trucker who knew every major highway and back road across 3 states. It was the thrill of the open road that kept him going, but there were routes even he dreaded. Roads that older truckers whispered about in dimly lit diners at 3 a.m. One such route was Route 23, also known as the Lost Path, which snaked through dense, uncharted forests and was said to be cursed. It was Halloween night, and Ben found himself taking that very route as a last-minute job to deliver a shipment before dawn. The pay was too good to pass up, and besides, he didn't believe in ghost stories. The air was thick with fog, curling around the truck like grasping fingers as the radio played a soft country tune. He adjusted his hat and muttered, "Just another road." Miles rolled by, the forest closing in tighter, the shadows deepening as his headlights swept over gnarled branches. The radio signal crackled and died, leaving him in an eerie silence broken only by the hum of the engine and the rhythmic thump of tires on cracked asphalt. A sudden flash of light in the rearview mirror caught his eye. Behind him, another set of headlights appeared, moving fast. Ben squinted. It was another truck, its beams cutting through the fog like knives. Relief washed over him. He wasn't alone out here after all. He turned on the CB radio and called out, "Hey there, looks like we're on the same midnight run. What's your 20? Static. Then a burst of laughter, sharp and grating, followed by a voice that made his blood turn to ice. "You shouldn't be here, driver." Ben's grip tightened on the wheel as the voice echoed, bouncing around the cab like an unwanted guest. The truck behind him surged closer, its lights flaring brighter until they bathed the entire cabin in a blinding white glow. Ben's heart raced as he kept glancing in the rearview mirror. The headlights behind him bore down with relentless intensity, filling the cab with a light so bright it hurt to look at. He flipped the rearview mirror up and clenched his jaw, focusing on the road as it twisted and dipped through the forest. The other truck's roar grew louder, its engine a metallic growl that sent shivers down his spine. Suddenly, the truck swerved to the side and began to overtake him. As it pulled up alongside, Ben stole a look and immediately wished he hadn't. The cab was empty. No driver, no passenger, just an empty seat and a steering wheel turning as if gripped by invisible hands. The truck matched his speed, moving side by side in a ghostly dance. Ben's chest tightened and he stomped on the accelerator. His truck groaned as it picked up speed, but the phantom vehicle kept pace, its headlights pulsating in a rhythmic, hypnotic pattern. The laughter from the CB crackled back to life, shrill and mocking. "Join us, Ben," the voice taunted, this time clearer and more familiar. It was the voice of Jim, an old trucker friend who disappeared on this very route years ago. Ben's mouth went dry as he remembered the stories, the tales of lost truckers who vanished without a trace, only to be seen again in the headlights of spectral convoys. Ben gritted his teeth and yanked the wheel to the left, veering into a narrow side road marked only by an ancient broken sign. The phantom truck swerved sharply but kept going straight, disappearing into the mist like a mirage. The silence that followed was deafening, and for a brief moment Ben thought he'd outpaced it, but the feeling of victory was short-lived. The radio crackled again. "You can run, Ben, but you're already ours." Ahead, the road split into two. one path leading deeper into the dark forest, the other lined with flickering lanterns that cast an unnatural, sickly glow. Ben's instincts screamed at him to choose the road without lights, but the haunting pull of the glowing path was too strong. As he turned down the lit path, the temperature in the cab plummeted. Frost crept across the windshield, and the lanterns seemed to flicker faster, casting moving shadows that writhed and reached like skeletal fingers. He fought the urge to stop, to jump out and abandon the truck, but knew deep down that leaving wouldn't save him. The road ahead opened into a clearing, and Ben's breath caught in his throat. Parked in a perfect circle were trucks, old, rusted rigs with shattered windows and dented doors, all covered in the grime of time. Each one was a tombstone to a driver who had come before him. The CB radio roared to life, a cacophony of voices overlapping, pleading, crying, laughing. And then, there was Jim's voice again, but softer this time. "Why didn't you listen?" The headlights of the parked trucks blazed to life, illuminating the clearing in an unnatural blue-tinged light. The shadows cast by the glow crept toward Ben's truck, slithering up the sides and across the hood, pulling him toward the center of the circle. Ben pressed the gas, but the wheels spun uselessly. He was trapped, the truck's engine wheezing as if suffocating under an unseen weight. A shape moved in the distance, stepping into the circle of light. It was Jim, or what was left of him. His face was a pale mask, eyes black hollows that oozed a shadowy mist. He raised a hand, and Ben felt an invisible force pin him against the seat. "Every road ends, Ben," Jim whispered, stepping closer. "Yours just took a little detour." Ben's scream was lost in the cacophony as the spectral convoy roared to life. The trucks moved, circling around him with blinding lights and deafening horns. He struggled, fought against the unseen force, but it was like pushing against stone. The last thing he saw was Jim's face, breaking into a smile that split his pallid cheeks before darkness consumed him. When the sun rose over Route 23 the next day, the forest was silent. The clearing was empty, save for Ben's truck, parked with the door swinging gently in the breeze. The radio played static, a faint echo of laughter hidden within the crackle. Drivers passing through the area would sometimes swear they saw a convoy in the distance, trucks that disappeared when approached, or heard a voice on the CB that whispered warnings too late. And on certain nights, if you listened closely, you might hear Jim's voice, beckoning lost souls deeper into the woods, onto roads that should never be traveled. As the sun dipped behind the hills, Mike, a seasoned trucker, prepared for another late-night haul. It was routine. Drive long stretches, fight off sleep, and deliver goods on time. But something about the route tonight felt different. The air had a strange heaviness to it, and even the truck's engine seemed to be grumbling in protest, as if it sensed the ominous road ahead. This was the infamous Route 87. A lonely stretch of highway that many truckers avoided after dark. The legends surrounding the road were well known in the trucking community. Ghost sightings, inexplicable engine failures, and disappearances. Yet Mike wasn't the type to believe in such stories. After years on the road, he thought he'd seen it all. But tonight, something in the back of his mind gnawed at him, whispering that this would be no ordinary night. He climbed into his rig, adjusted his mirrors, and fired up the engine. The heavy headlights pierced the darkness as he accelerated onto the road. The truck rumbled forward, shaking slightly as it hit the rough, uneven asphalt. The faint hum of the tires on the road was the only sound for miles. As Mike cruised down the highway, a set of headlights appeared behind him. At first, it seemed like any other driver, but as the truck grew closer, Mike noticed something strange. The vehicle wasn't just following, it was speeding up, as though it had a mission to overtake him. The truck's silhouette grew larger in his rearview mirror, but there was something unsettling about it. The headlights were far too bright, almost blinding, and the truck seemed unnaturally close. Mike's grip on the steering wheel tightened. It wasn't just the speed of the truck, it was the way it loomed, the way it seemed to have no regard for the rules of the road. Mike slammed his foot on the accelerator, but the mystery truck did the same. It pulled alongside him just inches from his door, and Mike's heart skipped a beat when he saw the driver, or rather, the lack of one. The seat was empty. His pulse quickened as he glanced at the rearview mirror again. The truck was still there, staying side by side with him despite the obvious lack of a driver. A cold chill ran down his spine, and instinctively, he tried to pull ahead. But no matter how much he floored the pedal, the truck stayed right beside. Mike's breath quickened, and a sense of dread began to settle in his stomach. He wasn't sure what he was more afraid of, the fact that there was no driver in the truck beside him, or the unnerving sense that this was a warning, something far beyond his understanding. "Just keep driving," he muttered to himself, trying to shake off the panic creeping up his throat. But the truck beside him seemed to be toying with him. It would swerve closer to his rig, almost as if it were daring him to make a move, and then pull away at the last second. He glanced down at the CB radio, hoping for a sign of sanity, anything to prove that he wasn't losing his mind. As he reached for the mic, it crackled to life. "Turn back, Mike," a distorted voice warned, sending a jolt of fear through his body. "The road you're on doesn't let anyone leave once they've been marked." Mike's hand froze on the radio and he jerked his eyes back to the rearview mirror. The truck had disappeared. It was gone. The road behind him was empty, the headlights now nothing more than a faint memory. But the voice on the CB was still there, lingering in the static. "Once you're marked, there's no turning back." Mike, now visibly shaken, tried to rationalize the situation. Maybe it was a prank, some kind of joke played by fellow truckers. He grabbed the mic again and called out into the radio, hoping to get a response. Nothing. The silence hung heavily in the air, oppressive and thick. Mike pushed forward, determined to shake the eerie feeling, but his mind kept returning to the ghostly truck, the empty seat, the disembodied voice. Minutes stretched into hours, the dark road ahead never seeming to end. Just when Mike thought he could breathe again, a flash of light appeared in his side mirror. The same headlights, the same blinding glow. This time it wasn't just one truck. It was a convoy. Several trucks, all identical, moving in unison, forming a circle around him. Their engines hummed in unison, and as they closed in, Mike could hear the faint sound of tires skimming against the road. Almost like the trucks were gliding, floating instead of driving. The trucks didn't make a sound as they surrounded him. They formed a tight circle, trapping Mike in their midst. And in the center, their headlights revealed what was happening in the cab of each rig. There were no drivers, only empty seats, swaying with the movements of the trucks, as if they were inhabited by something else. Mike's heart pounded against his chest as his truck lurched forward, unable to break free from the circle. His hands shook, gripping the wheel tightly as he tried to escape the ghostly convoy. He knew what he had to do. He had to stop. He had to find a way out of the trap. But the trucks moved with a purpose, as if they were playing a game, as if they were forcing him to follow their every move. The lights grew brighter, almost blinding. The shadows grew longer, wrapping around Mike's truck, suffocating him. "Help!" he screamed into the radio. "Anyone please help me!" The voice on the CB crackled again, but this time it was different. It was calm, but it was full of malice. "You shouldn't have driven down this road, Mike. Once you've seen the curse, there's no going back." Before he could respond, a voice echoed through the truck's speakers, distorted and alien, causing Mike to freeze. "Welcome to the night hauler's curse." In the blink of an eye, the convoy vanished. The trucks, the lights, everything disappeared, leaving Mike alone on the road once more. His hands were trembling. He checked the rearview mirror. No trucks, no lights. The road behind him was empty, but something was different now. He was marked. Mike's truck jerked to a halt as his engine sputtered and died. The lights blinked off, leaving him in complete darkness. The eerie silence returned. Then, the radio buzzed again. "Welcome to the crew, Mike," the voice said, far too familiar now. It was the voice of a lost trucker who had disappeared years ago. A warning. A promise. Mike knew, deep in his bones, that he was now one of them. A cursed hauler who would drive these haunted roads forever, part of the convoy that never stopped, never went home. The night hauler's curse was not just a story, it was real, and Mike was now forever bound to it. Ryan had been driving trucks for over a decade, and in all his years on the road, he thought he had seen it all. From dodging bad weather to dealing with treacherous terrain, nothing fazed him anymore. But Black Hollow Road was different. It was a stretch of highway that even the most seasoned drivers avoided after dark. Legends swirled about this place, disappearances, ghostly figures, and strange happenings that sent chills down the spine of anyone brave enough to drive through it. The road had a history, a long, dark history of drivers who started their journey on Black Hollow Road, only to vanish without a trace. Some said it was the restless spirits of the old mining town that had once stood there, now abandoned and forgotten. Others claimed it was something more sinister, something tied to the very earth that had swallowed the town whole. Ryan had heard the stories, but he never gave them much thought. He was a man of logic, of reason, and the supernatural was something he reserved for campfire tales. That is, until tonight. It was a cold evening in late October, and Ryan was on his way to make a late-night delivery. The truck's headlights illuminated the road ahead, casting long shadows over the trees that flanked either side. The night was still, unnaturally so. There was no wind, no movement, only the steady hum of the truck's engine. It was as though the entire world had gone quiet. Ryan checked his GPS, confirming that Black Hollow Road was just up ahead. He had to take the route. There was no other way around it. But the closer he got, the more he felt that something was wrong. He couldn't explain it, but his instincts were screaming at him to turn back, to take a different route, to avoid Black Hollow Road altogether. But that was the thing about truckers. They were used to driving long distances, often alone, with nothing but the road ahead of them. You push through the discomfort, the unease, because that's what you do. And so, Ryan kept going. As Ryan entered Black Hollow Road, the atmosphere seemed to change immediately. The air felt thicker, heavier, as if the very atmosphere was pressing down on him. The trees lining the road grew denser, their twisted branches reaching out like gnarled fingers, casting strange shadows across the pavement. The headlights of his truck seemed to cut through the darkness like a knife, but the shadows never seemed to fully retreat. It was as though the road itself was alive, watching him, waiting for something. Ryan tried to shake off the creeping sense of dread that was taking root in his chest. He focused on the road, his hands tightly gripping the steering wheel as he navigated the winding curves. But as he approached a sharp bend in the road, something strange caught his eye. A figure, a woman, standing by the side of the road. At first he thought it was a hitchhiker, but something felt off about her. Her clothes were ragged, and her hair was wild, as though it hadn't been brushed in days. She was standing perfectly still, staring straight ahead, her gaze unblinking and unwavering. Ryan slowed the truck, his mind racing. Was it safe to stop? Should he offer her a ride? He couldn't help but feel a strange compulsion to pull over, but the rational part of him fought back. This was Black Hollow Road. This was where people disappeared. He pressed on the accelerator, his eyes darting to the rearview mirror as he passed the woman. But as the truck rumbled past, he swore he saw her reflection in the glass. Her eyes locked onto his, filled with a sorrow so deep that it sent a chill through his spine. Before he could process what had just happened, the truck's engine sputtered. The headlights flickered, and the radio crackled to life, but no one was speaking. Only static. The truck jerked to a stop and Ryan's heart pounded in his chest. He tried the engine again, but it refused to turn over. He wasn't alone. Ryan's first instinct was to get out and check the engine. He opened the door and stepped out into the cold night air, the sounds of the forest surrounding him. The trees swayed in the wind, their creaking branches the only sound breaking the silence. The headlights of his truck illuminated a small section of the road, but beyond that, the world was swallowed by darkness. He walked around the truck, checking the tires and the engine, but everything seemed fine. Nothing appeared to be wrong. He even checked the fuel gauge. It was full, yet the engine refused to start. Confused and frustrated, Ryan climbed back into the cab and tried the ignition once more, and that's when he saw it. In the distance, just beyond the reach of his headlights, the woman from earlier was standing there again. She was closer now, much closer, her pale face barely visible in the dim light. She wasn't alone. A man stood beside her, his face obscured by a hood. The woman reached out, her hand trembling, as if beckoning him to come closer. Ryan's blood ran cold as his instincts screamed at him to leave, to get back on the road and never look back. But he couldn't move. His body was paralyzed, as though the very sight of them had taken control of his mind. He stared at the two figures, his breath shallow and rapid. The man lifted his head, revealing his face, a gaunt, hollow face with empty, sunken eyes. "Leave this road," the man whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "Before it's too late." Suddenly, the truck roared to life. The engine purred like a lion, and the headlights flickered back on. Ryan didn't hesitate. He slammed his foot on the accelerator and sped away, the figures disappearing into the darkness as the truck tore down the road. Ryan didn't stop until he reached the nearest town. His hands were still shaking, his heart racing. He pulled into a truck stop, parked his rig, and sat there staring at the dashboard, trying to calm himself. He couldn't explain what had just happened. The strange woman, the hooded man, the warning. He stepped out of the truck and walked inside the small diner, hoping to get something to eat and clear his mind. As he ordered a coffee, he overheard a conversation at the counter. An older man, who looked like he'd been driving these roads for years, was talking to the waitress. "You were out there last night, huh?" the waitress asked. "On Black Hollow Road?" The trucker nodded, his face serious. "It's not a road you want to be on, especially after dark. You can't outrun the past. Black Hollow's got a way of pulling you in. It's got its own rules." Ryan's curiosity piqued, and he approached the counter. "What do you mean? What's so special about that road?" The trucker looked him up and down before answering. "The road's cursed. You saw the woman, didn't you? She's been out there for years, ever since the town burned down. Some say she was the last to leave. Some say she never left at all." Ryan listened intently, but the man's next words made his blood run cold. "If you've seen her," he continued, "then you've already been marked. You're a part of it now, and you'll never be able to leave Black Hollow Road." Ryan's mind raced as he processed the trucker's words. He had heard the stories about the road, but this was something far worse than he had imagined. The woman, the man, the warning. When he went back to his truck, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The road was no longer just a road. It was a trap, a place where the living and the dead coexisted, and where the past had a way of catching up with you. As he drove away from the diner, the silence on the road seemed heavier than before. The trees appeared darker, the shadows longer, and the further he drove, the more he felt the weight of the curse on his shoulders. He had been marked. There was no escaping Black Hollow Road now. Ryan tried to leave the road, but every time he took a different route, he found himself back on Black Hollow Road. The same twisted trees, the same eerie silence, the same haunting presence of the woman and the hooded man. No matter how many times he tried to turn around, the road would always pull him back, like a magnet. His truck would stall, his GPS would malfunction, and he'd end up right back where he started. It was as if Black Hollow Road had claimed him, body and soul, and now he was forever bound to it, a part of the cursed history that haunted the road, a lost soul who would never escape its grasp. And so, Ryan continued to drive, endlessly, on that cursed road, trapped, just like all the others before him. It was a stormy night, one of those nights where the rain poured down in sheets, and the wind howled through the trees like a mournful cry. Kevin, a long-haul trucker, had been on the road for what felt like an eternity. He had been driving for over 12 hours straight, and his eyes were heavy. He needed to stop, rest, and refuel before continuing his journey. As he pulled into a small, isolated truck stop on the outskirts of a small town, Kevin was relieved to see that it was open. The neon sign flickered, casting an eerie glow over the damp pavement. The place was practically empty. Only a few trucks were parked, their drivers nowhere to be seen. Kevin parked his rig and climbed out, stretching his tired legs before heading into the diner. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of stale coffee and greasy food. The diner's fluorescent lights buzzed softly, and a lone waitress stood behind the counter, wiping down the surface. Her tired eyes met Kevin's, and she gave him a small, almost disinterested smile as he walked in. "Late night?" she asked, her voice lacking the usual warmth of small-town hospitality. "Yeah, long haul. Need a break," Kevin replied, taking a seat at the counter. "Is this place all right to stop at?" The waitress's smile faltered slightly, and she glanced over her shoulder toward the window, where the rain was beating against the glass. "This truck stop? It's been around for a while. Some people say it's haunted. I don't know if I believe in that stuff, but you'll see what you see." Kevin raised an eyebrow, but the exhaustion in his body made him less interested in the supernatural and more focused on getting something to eat and getting some rest. The waitress poured him a cup of coffee, setting it down in front of him with a quiet sigh. The storm outside raged on, its thunder cracking in the distance. "Doesn't look like anyone else is here," Kevin said, trying to make conversation. "Well, not everyone is brave enough to stop here after dark," she replied with a hollow chuckle. "But they don't usually stay long either." The warning in her voice piqued Kevin's curiosity, but he didn't push it. He was too tired. He needed sleep. Little did he know that the night he had planned to rest would become the most terrifying experience of his life. Kevin ate his meal in silence, occasionally glancing out the diner's window as the storm showed no sign of letting up. The thunder rumbled in the distance, and the rain fell in torrents. As he ate, he noticed something unsettling, a faint sound, like the scraping of metal against metal, coming from somewhere outside. At first, he tried to ignore it, assuming it was just the storm. But the noise continued, growing louder and more persistent. Kevin's heart began to race, his fatigue momentarily forgotten. He stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the storm, but saw nothing unusual. The truck stop appeared empty, the only movement coming from the trees as the wind blew them back and forth. He returned to his seat and tried to shake off the feeling of unease creeping over him. As he finished his meal, he noticed something else. A figure standing outside the diner, barely visible in the dim light. It was a man, tall and thin, dressed in a tattered jacket. He was staring directly at Kevin through the window. Kevin's pulse quickened and he instinctively looked away, not wanting to make eye contact with the strange figure. But when he looked back, the man was gone. The window was empty once more. Kevin's heart pounded in his chest, and he looked around the diner nervously, but the waitress was nowhere to be seen. The place was suddenly eerily silent, and Kevin could feel the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. A sudden knock on the window startled him. He spun around, but no one was there. Just the rain, slashing against the glass. Kevin began to feel like he was losing his mind, or that he was trapped in some kind of nightmare. Was the storm playing tricks on him? Was he imagining things? He looked down at his coffee, trying to collect his thoughts, but the atmosphere in the truck stop felt heavy, oppressive almost. That's when he noticed the old jukebox in the corner of the diner. It hadn't been on earlier, but now it was humming quietly as though it had come to life on its own. Kevin's eyes widened in confusion. He was certain the jukebox had been off when he had entered the diner, but now the faint sound of a song began to play, an old, eerie melody that sent shivers down his spine. The song continued to play, But as the sound of the music filled the room, Kevin heard another sound, a faint whisper. At first it was so quiet that he thought it was just his imagination. But then it grew louder, more distinct. "Leave. Now. Before it's too late." Kevin froze. The voice was not the waitress's, and it wasn't anyone else he had seen in the diner. The whisper seemed to be coming from the very walls of the truck stop itself. The lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the diner seemed to warp and shift, the shadows bending in unnatural ways. Suddenly, the jukebox shut off with a sharp click, and everything went silent. Kevin's heart raced as he tried to calm himself. There had to be an explanation for all this. He stood up and walked to the door, his mind a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He needed to get back to his truck, start the engine, and leave this place. But as he reached for the door, it swung open on its own. A cold breeze blew in from outside, carrying the scent of wet earth and something more. Decayed. Kevin stepped back, his mind racing. The door had opened by itself, and there was no sign of the waitress or any other person. He called out into the night, but there was no answer. Suddenly, a low, guttural growl echoed from the darkness. Kevin turned, eyes wide with panic. From the corner of his vision, he saw movement. A dark figure emerged from the shadows, its eyes glowing an unnatural red. Before he could react, the figure lunged, and everything went black. Kevin awoke with a start, gasping for air. He was lying on the cold floor of the diner, his body aching, his clothes drenched in sweat. He tried to move, but his limbs felt heavy, as though they were trapped in some kind of dream. The diner was silent once again, but something was wrong. The air felt different, thicker, charged with an unsettling energy. Kevin slowly stood up, his mind still foggy, and glanced around the diner. The jukebox was now off, but the shadows in the corner seemed to shift as if something was watching him. He stumbled to the door, hoping to escape, but as he touched the handle, the door slammed shut with a loud bang. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping rapidly, and Kevin could see his breath in the air. "Who's there?" Kevin called out, his voice trembling. "What's going on?" The answer came in the form of a laugh, a deep, hollow laugh that echoed from every corner of the room. And then a voice, deep and raspy, whispered from the shadows. "You shouldn't have stayed, Kevin." His heart stopped. It was the same voice from before, the whisper that had told him to leave. But this time it was different. It wasn't just a warning. It was a threat. Kevin tried to break free, but his legs were frozen, as though the very floor beneath him was holding him in place. His eyes darted around the diner, searching for an escape, but the walls seemed to close in around him. And then, in the far corner of the room, he saw her, the waitress. But she wasn't the same. Her eyes were black, her face twisted in a grotesque expression of fear and anger. Her mouth opened, and she screamed, "Run, Kevin, it's too late!" But before he could move, the room erupted into chaos. Shadows filled the space, swirling around him, and a voice boomed in his mind, drowning out everything else. "You've entered the truck stop, and now you will never leave." Tom, a seasoned truck driver, had seen it all on the open road. He'd driven through treacherous mountain passes, been caught in fierce snowstorms, and had even pulled over to help stranded motorists in the middle of nowhere. But nothing had prepared him for the night he would encounter something that defied all logic and reason. It started like any other long haul. He was on his way to deliver a load of goods, his rig humming steadily along the highway as the headlights cut through the dark. The clock on the dashboard showed it was well past midnight, and the miles seemed to stretch on endlessly. The truck was his home away from home. He was used to the isolation, the long stretches of highway where the only company was the hum of the engine and the occasional radio station crackling in and out. But tonight, there was something different. A strange feeling had settled over Tom, a sense of unease he couldn't shake off. He kept glancing in his rearview mirror, half expecting to see something or someone tailing him. But all he saw was the empty stretch of road behind him, lit by the faint glow of his truck's taillights. He had been driving for hours, and his eyelids were growing heavy. The exhaustion weighed on him, and he knew he needed to stop soon. Tom decided to pull off at a small truck stop he saw in the distance. It wasn't much, just a few dim lights and a small diner that looked like it hadn't seen a customer in years. But it was a place to rest, and he didn't want to push his luck on the empty road any longer. As Tom pulled into the parking lot, he noticed that the place was eerily quiet. No other trucks were parked, and there were no signs of life. The diner's neon sign flickered, casting an unsettling glow. He hesitated for a moment, then shrugged it off. A truck stop was a truck stop after all. Tom parked his rig and walked inside. The bell above the door jingled as he entered, but there was no one behind the counter. The place was deserted. He looked around, but there was no sign of the waitress or anyone else. The diner had a dusty, abandoned feel to it, but Tom's tiredness won out, and he decided to sit at one of the booths. As he settled into the booth, the door to the diner swung open, and an older man walked in. His clothes were worn, his face weathered with age, but his eyes— there was something about his eyes that unsettled Tom. They were wide and nervous, flicking around the room as if he were expecting someone or something to appear. The man didn't make eye contact with Tom, but instead shuffled to the counter, sitting down on one of the stools. Tom tried to ignore the strange man, but his presence was unsettling. The man's hands shook as he ordered a cup of coffee, his voice low and barely audible. Tom tried to focus on the menu, but the man's whispered muttering seemed to echo in his mind. "Don't trust the road. Don't trust the detour," the man mumbled, his voice trembling. Tom frowned. "What do you mean?" he asked, his curiosity piqued. The man looked up at him then, his eyes wild. "It's not just a road, it's a trap. A place where lost souls wander. You shouldn't be here. Turn back. Go anywhere else." Before Tom could respond, the man stood up abruptly and left the diner without another word. Tom stared after him, his mind racing. He had heard rumors about haunted places, stories of truck stops with a dark history, but he dismissed them as nothing more than urban legends. Still, the warning lingered in his mind. He finished his coffee, paid the bill, and decided it was time to get back on the road. But as he stepped outside, something felt off. The air was thick with fog, and the headlights of his truck illuminated the mist as he climbed into the cab. Tom didn't know it yet, but the road ahead would lead him to a nightmare he could never escape. Tom continued down the highway, his headlights cutting through the fog, but something didn't feel right. The road seemed to stretch endlessly before him, and no matter how far he drove, the scenery never changed. The trees lining the road were tall and shadowy, their branches twisting into unnatural shapes in the mist. He had been driving for an hour when he noticed something strange. The exit signs, which should have been familiar, seemed to blur and distort as if the words were shifting before his eyes. He rubbed his eyes, trying to clear the fogginess in his vision, but when he looked again, the road signs were still unreadable. The familiar landmarks he had passed earlier were gone. Tom's heart began to race. He wasn't sure where he was anymore. The highway had changed, morphed into something unfamiliar and unsettling. He glanced at the map on the dashboard, but it was no help. His GPS was acting up too, its screen flashing erratically as if it couldn't find his location. Panic started to rise in his chest. He turned the wheel, trying to find a way off the road, but every turn only led him deeper into the fog. The truck's engine seemed to grow louder in the silence, a constant hum that echoed in his ears. Suddenly, the road began to narrow, the trees on either side closing in. It was as if the highway itself was pushing him forward, forcing him to continue down this endless path. The fog thickened, and the air grew colder, a chill seeping into the truck's cab. Tom's breath fogged in front of him, and he shivered involuntarily. It felt as though the road had a life of its own, guiding him toward something he couldn't understand. But he didn't have a choice. He was stuck. The detour had been made, and now he was part of it, caught in a cycle he couldn't escape. As the fog grew denser, Tom began to hear something else, a faint, distant sound that seemed to be calling to him. It was soft at first, just a whisper on the wind, but then it grew louder. The sound of voices? The voices were faint at first, just barely audible above the roar of the truck's engine. But as the fog thickened, they grew louder. They sounded like whispers, like a dozen voices talking over one another, all saying different things at once. Tom tried to ignore them, telling himself it was just his mind playing tricks on him, but the voices persisted. He rolled down the window, hoping the cool night air would clear his head, but instead, the voices rushed in, swirling around him like a storm. The words became clearer now, distinct phrases that made his blood run cold. "Turn back," one voice hissed. "You're too late," another whispered. "There's no escape," a third warned. Tom's hands tightened around the wheel as the whispers seemed to grow louder, more insistent. His heart was pounding in his chest, and he could feel a cold sweat forming on his forehead. The road ahead was becoming more and more disorienting, the trees now pressing in on both sides, their twisted branches reaching toward him like skeletal hands. The whispers were almost deafening now, and Tom could feel the weight of their words sinking into his mind. He was trapped. There was no turning back. Suddenly, a figure appeared in the distance, standing in the middle of the road. Tom slammed on the brakes, his heart racing as the truck screeched to a halt just inches from the figure. The fog parted momentarily, revealing the figure of a man standing motionless in the middle of the road. The man was tall, his face obscured by a hood. He stood there without moving, his arms hanging by his sides. Tom's pulse raced as he stared at the figure, unsure of what to do. He honked the horn, but the figure didn't move. Without thinking, Tom threw the truck into reverse, trying to get away, but the figure didn't disappear. Instead, the fog thickened again, swallowing the road behind him. And then, the voices stopped. Tom's breathing came in short, frantic gasps as he slammed the truck into drive once again. He had to get out of here. He had to find a way to escape whatever was going on. But the road, the fog, the voices, it all seemed to be closing in on him, trapping him in an endless loop. Every time he tried to turn around, the road stretched out in front of him, the same eerie, empty stretch of highway. No exits, no signs, no way out. Hours passed, or was it days? Time had no meaning here. Tom had lost track, the truck's dashboard clock spinning aimlessly, the numbers flickering as if even time itself was caught in a loop. And then, he saw it, a light in the distance, the first sign of something real. He floored the gas pedal, desperate to reach it, but as he got closer, the light began to dim, flickering as though it were a mirage. Tom's heart sank. He wasn't getting closer to it at all. Instead, the light began to recede, pulling away from him as though it was just a figment of his imagination. The fog closed in around him once more, and the voices returned louder than ever, mocking him, tormenting him. Tom's hands slipped off the wheel as he finally lost control. His truck veered off the road, crashing into the trees, but even as the metal twisted and crumpled around him, there was no escape from the road, no escape from the endless loop that awaited him on the long road to nowhere.
Joe had been driving for years, and no stretch of road had ever fazed him. He was used to the isolation of the long hauls, the sound of his rig's engine rumbling beneath him as he cruised down highways that seemed to stretch to infinity. But there was one road that Joe would never forget, a road that seemed to hold something far more sinister than just asphalt and miles of scenery. It was Route 66. This iconic highway had long been a symbol of freedom, a path across the American heartland that had been used by countless travelers over the years. But for Joe, something about it always felt off. Maybe it was the way the road seemed to curve unnaturally. or how the gas stations and motels that once dotted the route now sat abandoned and decaying, their signs flickering in the darkness as if trying to communicate something to those who dared to pass by. Joe had been on Route 66 countless times, but on this particular night, he felt the eeriest sense of foreboding. He was on his way to deliver a shipment to a small town just off the highway, but he was running behind schedule, and the dark sky above him seemed to make the road feel longer than it ever had before. The headlights of his rig pierced the blackness, but the night felt suffocating. The air was thick, and there was no breeze to break the stifling silence. As he drove on, he noticed something strange, a reflection in his side mirror. It was faint but unmistakable. A set of headlights trailing him, growing closer. Joe frowned. There shouldn't be anyone else on this stretch of road at this time of night. He'd passed through several small towns, and the last gas station he'd seen was miles back. So why was there another vehicle behind him? He glanced in the mirror again, but the headlights had disappeared. Odd, he thought. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a distant memory of the long road that made him see things that weren't really there. But as he looked ahead, he saw it. The road stretched endlessly into the dark, but there was something wrong with it now. The scenery, the trees, the hills, they all seemed to warp and twist in the reflection of his headlights. It was as if the road itself was moving, curling around him, pulling him deeper into the night. Joe's pulse quickened. He shook his head, trying to push the thought from his mind. It had to be exhaustion, he reasoned. He'd been on the road for too long, and the isolation was starting to get to him. Just focus on the road, he told himself. Get to the delivery, and everything would be fine. But as he continued down Route 66, the feeling of being watched never left him. He couldn't shake the sense that someone or something was out there, just beyond his reach, waiting for him to make the wrong move. It wasn't long before Joe's unease turned into outright fear. As he drove deeper into the night, the road seemed to grow narrower, the trees pressing in on either side. He was beginning to feel like he was trapped in a tunnel of dark and shadow with no way out. His headlights flickered, casting strange shadows on the road, and in the periphery of his vision, he saw shapes moving just beyond the tree line. He thought he saw figures standing there, watching him. But when he turned his head to get a better look, there was nothing. Just empty trees and endless road. Then, the sound started. At first, it was faint, just a whisper in the wind. But then it grew louder, a distant hum that seemed to be coming from all around him. Joe strained to hear, his mind racing. Was it the engine of another truck? The hum of the wind? No, it was something else. It was too constant, too deliberate. It was a voice that seemed to echo in his mind. Keep driving, Joe, keep going. Joe's blood ran cold. There was no one else on the road. No other truckers. And yet the voice seemed to know his name, seemed to know everything about him. He jerked the wheel, trying to shake off the growing sense of dread that was creeping up his spine. But the voice didn't stop. Turn back. Turn around, Joe. You're going the wrong way. Joe's grip on the wheel tightened. His eyes darted from side to side, but there was no sign of any other vehicles. No one. Nothing. Just the eerie, never-ending stretch of Route 66, a road that seemed to swallow him whole. That's when he saw it. Another set of headlights, just a flicker in the distance. This time, the light was unmistakable. A truck, large and looming, barreling toward him. Joe's heart skipped a beat. How had this truck caught up with him so quickly? He hadn't seen it for miles, and now it was right behind him, closing in with a speed that was unnerving. The truck's headlights seemed to shine brighter, blinding him momentarily. Joe squinted against the light, trying to focus, but as the truck grew closer, he realized something was terribly wrong. The rig didn't have a driver. The cab was empty, the wheel turning by itself, as if some unseen force was controlling the vehicle. It swerved, coming too close, almost clipping the side of Joe's truck. Panicking, Joe slammed his foot on the gas pedal, trying to outrun the phantom truck. But no matter how fast he went, the other vehicle stayed right behind him, inching closer with every turn. The voice continued, now rising to a crescendo. "Keep driving, Joe. Keep driving. Or else." Joe's hands were slick with sweat as he gripped the steering wheel. The phantom truck was still trailing him, and the voice was now a constant, maddening whisper in his ears. He didn't know how much longer he could take it. The road was endless, stretching on, with no signs of civilization in sight. And still, the truck followed. He needed a place to stop, a place to clear his head. Then up ahead he saw it. A small, dilapidated motel, its neon sign flickering weakly in the distance. It was the only sign of life in the vast emptiness around him, and he decided to pull in. He didn't care if it was run down or abandoned, he just needed a break from the madness. Joe swung into the parking lot and parked his rig near the entrance. He got out of the truck, his legs shaky from the stress. The motel looked like something out of a nightmare, its windows boarded up, the paint peeling from the walls. But the door to the office was open, and a faint light glowed from inside. He walked up to the door, the floorboards creaking beneath his feet as he entered. Inside, the air was musty and stale, and the room was dimly lit by a flickering bulb overhead. Behind the counter, an old woman sat, her face pale and expressionless. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice hoarse and distant. Joe was hesitant, but he needed to talk to someone to get some clarity on what was happening. He asked for a room, and the woman handed him a key without saying another word. He took the key and walked down the dark hallway toward his room. The motel seemed even more sinister now that he was inside, the silence pressing in on him from all sides. But as he passed the last room before his own, he heard a noise, a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a whisper, a voice coming from behind the door. "Joe, you shouldn't have stopped." Joe froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He knew that voice. It was the same voice that had been following him down Route 66, the same voice that had haunted him since he first set foot on that desolate highway. It was the voice of the phantom driver. But when he turned around, the hallway was empty. Shaken, Joe turned and entered his room. He locked the door behind him, trying to steady his breath. The room was small, but it felt oppressive, as if the walls were closing in on him. He could still hear the distant hum of the phantom truck outside, and the voice that had taunted him was now louder than ever, echoing in his mind. "Turn back, Joe. You've crossed into the place where roads meet. You can never leave." Joe sat on the edge of the bed, his mind racing. He had to get out of here. He had to leave before whatever was haunting this place consumed him too. He walked back to the door, but when he tried to open it, he found that it was stuck, as if it had been sealed shut by some unseen force. In a panic, Joe tried to break the door down, but it wouldn't budge. The walls around him seemed to grow tighter, the air growing colder with every passing second. The voice now filled the room so loud that it drowned out all other sounds. And then, everything went silent. Joe opened his eyes, his heart pounding in his chest. He was no longer in the motel room. He was back on Route 66, his truck idling on the side of the road. But the highway was different now. It was no longer a road. It was a never-ending void, a place between life and death. The phantom truck was there, looming behind him, and the voice whispered one last time, "You should have never come, have never."
It was just another night for Jake. He had been a long-haul trucker for nearly 15 years, driving through the vast stretches of desolate highways that seemed to go on forever. There was a certain rhythm to the job, a routine that Jake had gotten used to. A trucker's life was filled with solitude, the hum of the engine being the only constant companion. But on this particular night, something felt off. Jake had been driving for hours, his destination a small town on the outskirts of nowhere. It was around 2 a.m.,
and the only lights on the road were the ones from his truck and the occasional flicker of distant streetlights that seemed to vanish as quickly as they appeared. His eyelids were heavy from exhaustion, but he had a job to finish. He couldn't afford to fall behind. As the road stretched ahead, Jake noticed something strange in his rearview mirror. There was a dim light behind him, a set of headlights that seemed to be approaching too quickly. He squinted into the mirror, trying to make out the vehicle's shape, but the light flickered and blinked, as if it were a faulty headlamp. He was on a long stretch of road with no turnoffs, so how could anyone be this close to him? Jake shrugged it off, telling himself it was probably another trucker who was speeding to catch up. He had seen it happen before, but when the light came closer, it didn't feel right. The headlights were unnaturally bright, almost blinding in the rearview mirror, and as Jake glanced up, he could see nothing but darkness in the mirror. The road behind him was clear, no truck, no headlights. "Must be seeing things," Jake muttered to himself, shaking his head. But that voice in the back of his mind wouldn't stop nagging him. He kept glancing nervously at the mirror, but each time it was the same. Nothing. Just an empty road. And then, for a brief moment, he felt it. A cold, sharp presence in the air, as if someone was sitting in the passenger seat beside him. But when Jake turned to look, there was no one there. The seat was empty. He felt a chill crawl up his spine. Must be exhaustion, he thought again, trying to rationalize the feeling. But the sensation of being watched didn't fade. It only grew stronger. Jake's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter as he pushed on, his eyes flicking nervously to the empty passenger seat. What was happening? Was he going crazy? Suddenly, a whisper broke the silence. "Jake." The voice was soft but unmistakable, coming from the empty passenger seat. He jerked his head toward it, but there was nothing there. No one. Just the vacant seat. "Who's there?" Jake demanded, his voice shaking as he looked around in the dark. There was no reply. Just the deep rumble of the truck's engine and the wind rushing past. Jake's heart raced. He couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching him. But he didn't dare look again. It wasn't long after the first incident that Jake noticed another oddity. His fuel gauge was dropping rapidly. He was certain he had filled up the tank just before starting the trip, and yet the gauge now showed less than a quarter tank. It didn't make any sense. He hadn't even taken a detour or driven off the highway. "What the hell?" Jake muttered, glancing at the gauge, then looking back at the road. It was around then that he saw the figure again, a shadow moving across the road, drifting slowly in his rearview mirror. But this time it wasn't just headlights. It was a figure, a man, walking slowly along the side of the highway, his face hidden in the shadows. Jake's heart skipped a beat. There was no reason anyone would be out here at this hour, let alone walking along such a desolate road. "Is this some kind of joke?" Jake said aloud, trying to convince himself that it wasn't real. But the figure grew clearer with each passing second, and as Jake slowed down to get a better look, his blood ran cold. The man's eyes were wide open, unblinking, and glowing faintly in the dark. His face was pale, almost lifeless, as if the very air around him was suffocating. Jake's stomach turned. Something about the man was wrong, utterly wrong, and yet the man never moved, as if he were waiting. Jake didn't want to stop, but his truck seemed to slow on its own, as if some unseen force was pulling him toward the figure. Panic surged through Jake, and with trembling hands, he slammed his foot on the gas pedal, speeding past the strange man. But as he looked back, the figure was still there, standing motionless by the side of the road, his eyes fixed on Jake's truck. A shiver ran down Jake's spine. He had to get away, but for some reason, he couldn't shake the feeling that the man was following him, watching his every move. He tried to push the thought out of his mind, but as the minutes passed, something seemed to change. The truck felt different, heavier, like it was struggling to move. The air inside the cab grew thick and heavy, and the sense of something lurking just beyond his sight grew stronger. Suddenly, Jake heard it again. The voice. Jake. This time it was closer, right next to him, whispering his name in a voice that was both familiar and chillingly distant. He could hear the voice of someone who was there but wasn't, the same way you hear someone calling your name from another room. A trick of the mind, or something more sinister. Jake spun his head around to the empty passenger seat, and there it was. The man from the road was sitting beside him now, his eyes wide open, unblinking, glowing faintly in the dim light. His cold, clammy hand rested on the armrest inches from Jake's own hand. "Who the hell are you?" Jake screamed, his voice cracking in terror. The figure said nothing but smiled, his lips curling into an unsettling grin that made Jake's blood run cold. "Why are you doing this to me?" Jake's voice was filled with panic now. He didn't know what was happening, but he knew he couldn't take it anymore. The figure leaned closer, his breath icy on Jake's face. And in a voice that seemed to echo in Jake's mind, the figure whispered, "I'm not going anywhere, Jake. You brought me with you, and now you're never going to be alone again." Jake's mind was racing as the figure sat beside him, its cold presence invading every inch of the truck. It wasn't just a passenger, it was something far worse. The air inside the cab grew colder, and Jake's breath came out in visible clouds. He glanced at the dashboard. His fuel gauge was still dropping, but it didn't make sense. He had just filled up, and now he was nearly empty. "What's happening?" Jake whispered to himself, his voice trembling. He wasn't sure if he was hallucinating, or if the nightmare was real, but the feeling of dread only intensified. He glanced at the figure again. The man was staring straight ahead, his expression blank, as if he were waiting for something. Jake tried to speed up, but no matter how fast he went, the figure stayed beside him, a constant presence that seemed to drain the life out of him with every passing second. As the miles passed, Jake began to notice something else. The road was different. It was no longer the highway he knew so well. The signs had disappeared. The road itself seemed to twist and bend unnaturally, as if it were alive, pulling him deeper into an abyss. Jake felt the truck lurch as if something was tugging at it from the darkness. His grip tightened on the wheel, but the truck seemed to take on a life of its own, veering off course, turning down side streets that weren't on the map. "No, no, no!" Jake screamed as the truck refused to stop. He slammed the brakes, but they didn't respond. He was trapped in the cab with the figure beside him, its eyes glowing with an eerie intensity. "What do you want from me?" Jake cried out, his voice hoarse with fear. The figure's grin widened, and it whispered one final time, "I'm not going anywhere. And neither are you." As Jake's truck continued to barrel down the twisted, impossible road, he realized that he wasn't just trapped physically. He was trapped in a nightmare that would never end. The truck seemed to be driving itself, its engine roaring as it sped down the highway at breakneck speeds. Jake could no longer see the road ahead. It was all darkness, an endless void that stretched into the unknown. The figure beside him remained still, its eyes fixed on Jake, unblinking, waiting. "Help me!" Jake screamed, but his voice was swallowed by the oppressive silence of the truck. The figure didn't react. It didn't need to. It had already won. The truck continued down the highway, and as Jake glanced out the window, he saw the shadows of trees and mountains swirling in the dark. He could hear the wind howling outside, but it was as if the world had stopped. There was no escape, no end. It was then that Jake understood. The curse had taken him. He wasn't just being haunted by a ghost. He was part of the curse now, a prisoner of the road, doomed to drive forever with the figure in the passenger seat. And so Jake drove, through the never-ending night, a shadow of himself, trapped in a world where time no longer mattered. The curse would never let him go.